Okay, now we're moving on to question number 4. And keep in mind that the questions do increase in difficulty as you move on through the sentence completion section. This is the only part of the critical reading section where the problems progress in difficulty. Once you get to the passage-based questions, that won't be the case because the questions follow the order of the paragraph. So you're not going to be able to get any insight into the level of difficulty of the question in the passage-based reading questions. I can talk later about which questions I think personally are more difficult, and we'll get to that when I move on to a passage-based reading. Okay, so number 4 says Francis learned that by blinking his anger and resentment and so avoiding blank, he could overcome opponents more successfully than could those who openly defied their adversaries. Okay, so now that we're further along in the sentence completion section, the vocab is becoming more difficult. So defied means basically that you oppose or go against somebody. It's like disagreeing and disobeying with somebody. An adversary, I imagine you've encountered this word in your English classes. So this would be somebody who's your opponents, or you might have encountered this in a sports game. So the team that you're playing against, those would be your adversary. So the people you're up against. Okay, so let's predict a word. Okay, so Francis learned that by doing something to his anger and resentment, he could avoid something. So we have to look at the words together and see if they make sense. So let's see which words work together. Okay, so by expressing his anger and resentment and so avoiding hostility, that doesn't make sense together. The words might be fine on their own, but it really doesn't work together. Because if you are expressing your anger, you wouldn't be avoiding hostility. Hostility is anger. Okay, let's check the next one. Francis learned that by suppressing his anger and resentment and so avoiding conflict, he could overcome opponents and more successfully. He could overcome opponents more successfully than could those who openly defied their adversaries. Okay, this looks pretty good to me because suppressing means withholding or stifling, holding back something. So in this case, anger and resentment. And so it makes sense that if you were to hide your anger and resentment, then you would be able to avoid conflicts and fights. That makes sense. It also makes sense when you contrast it with the second part of the sentence. The second part of the sentence is saying that there are these other people who openly argued against the people that they disagreed with. And Francis is being contrasted with those people. So this is pretty good, but let's just make sure we check out all the other answers. So that looks pretty good for now, but let's see. Okay, Francis learned that by stifling his anger and resentment and so avoiding temperance, he could overcome opponents. This doesn't make sense because temperance means moderation. You may have heard this when you were learning about prohibition and the temperance movement. This was a time when people were encouraged to not drink alcohol at all, or at least drink it in moderation. So this is a way to remember this vocabulary word temperance. So it doesn't make sense to say that Francis learned that by stifling, which is essentially the same as suppressing, holding back his anger and resentment, and so avoiding moderation. This doesn't make sense, avoiding moderation by stifling your anger and resentment. You would actually be, I suppose, being more moderate with your emotions if you were to stifle your anger and resentment, so that's not good. Okay. D, I like disguising in D. It makes sense that Francis would learn something by disguising his anger and resentment, but in doing so, he avoids deceit, which means lying or deception. This doesn't make sense because if he's hiding and lying about his level of anger and resentment, then he's not avoiding being dishonest. He's not avoiding deceit. Okay, and the last one, Francis learned that by rousing his anger and resentment and so avoiding wrath. So this is wrong for a similar reason that A is wrong, because the words just don't work together. Rousing means stirring up your anger and resentment, inspiring anger and resentment. And so if you were doing that, you would not be avoiding anger. So therefore E is wrong. And now we can feel great about picking our choice B.